There was a time when a handful of store names basically ran American shopping. Sears was bigger than Amazon is today, relative to the economy. Toys R Us decided which toys kids even knew existed. Now half of these names are either gone completely or hanging on with a fraction of what they used to be. So today, we're counting down 10 stores that used to be American retail kings, and now they're in ruins. Number 10. Payless ShoeSource. Founded in Topeka, Kansas in 1956 by cousins Louis and Sheol Pozes, Payless built its entire business model around a genuinely simple idea. Let customers grab shoes off self-service shelves themselves instead of waiting on a salesperson and pass the savings along. It worked spectacularly well. By 1991, Payless had grown from $700 million in annual sales just 6 years earlier to $1.5 billion. And at its peak, the chain operated more than 4,400 stores across over 30 countries, making it, by its own account, the largest specialty footwear retailer in the entire Western Hemisphere. The end came in two distinct waves. Payless first filed for bankruptcy in April of 2017, closing several hundred stores and shedding roughly $435 million in debt before emerging that same year with about 3,500 locations still standing. The reprieve didn't last. A second bankruptcy filing in February of 2019 proved terminal, with the company announcing it would liquidate all 2,500 of its remaining US and Puerto Rico stores entirely, one of the largest single retail liquidations in American history at the time. Payless did technically return in 2020 with a relaunched e-commerce site and plans for a small number of new physical locations, dropping ShoeSource from its name in the process, but the version of Payless that once anchored strip malls in nearly every American town is gone for good. The company's own leadership was fairly candid about what finally did it in. Chief Restructuring Officer Stephen Marotta said plainly that Payless had emerged from its first bankruptcy ill-equipped to survive in today's retail environment, an admission that the 2017 restructuring had trimmed costs without actually fixing the underlying business. Part of that underlying problem was timing that could hardly have been worse. Payless's core customer base, budget-conscious shoppers looking for the cheapest reasonable pair of shoes, was exactly the demographic migrating fastest toward online retail during the 2000s. Yet the company had underinvested in exactly the digital infrastructure that demographic increasingly expected. Number 9. Borders. Brothers Tom and Louis Borders opened an 800-square-foot used bookstore in Ann Arbor, Michigan in 1971 and built a genuine competitive edge early on through custom inventory software that let the store track sales and stock with unusual precision for the era. Kmart acquired Borders in 1992 for $125 million, merging it with the mall-based Walden Books chain, and the combined company expanded aggressively through the 1990s into the sprawling superstore format most people remember. Big box locations stacked with books, music, and DVDs, complete with cafes and author events. At its peak in 2003, Borders operated 1,249 stores across the United States, United Kingdom, Singapore, and Australia. Borders' downfall reads like a checklist of nearly every mistake a legacy retailer could make heading into the internet era. The company outsourced its own online bookstore to Amazon for years, effectively handing its most engaged digital customers directly to its eventual biggest competitor. It arrived late to ebooks and e-readers, and its aging superstore leases left it locked into expensive, oversized real estate right as digital reading started eating into physical book sales. Borders filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy in February of 2011, and after failing to secure new financing, announced full liquidation that July. The last of its more than 1,200 stores closed by September 18, 2011, with rival Barnes & Noble picking up Borders' trademarks and customer list for a mere $13.9 million. Mike Edwards, the company's final CEO, later described the emotional weight of walking through the door of Borders' Ann Arbor headquarters after filing the liquidation paperwork, only to be met by hundreds of employees applauding him and his CFO for a full 20 minutes, despite the devastating news. Edwards had spent months, right up until the final hours, trying to close a refinancing deal that he believed was 90% complete, only to learn the night before a scheduled bankruptcy court hearing that liquidation was the only path left. It's a detail that captures something true about most of the collapses on this list. These weren't companies that gave up easily. They were companies that ran out of runway despite genuinely trying to find a way out. Number 8. RadioShack. RadioShack traces its roots to 1921, when it opened as a single store in Boston catering to ham radio operators. Charles Tandy acquired the small 9-store chain for just $300,000 in 1962, and under Tandy's leadership, RadioShack grew into America's go-to electronics retailer, famously boasting that 90% of Americans lived within 5 minutes of a store. By the 1990s, RadioShack operated more than 7,000 locations and pulled in roughly $3 billion in annual revenue. And it played a genuinely important role in early personal computing history by releasing the TR-80, one of the first mass-produced home computers, in 1977. RadioShack's collapse stemmed largely from a strategic identity crisis. Rather than doubling down on the specialty electronics expertise that made it unique, the company chased the crowded wireless phone market, competing directly against carriers and big-box stores with no particular advantage of its own. E-commerce arrived at RadioShack roughly 6 years after Amazon had already established itself. A head start online retailers never relinquished. The company filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy in February of 2015 with more than $1 billion in debt, closing around 2,400 stores while selling roughly 1,750 more to Sprint in a co-branding arrangement that ultimately failed to save the business. A second bankruptcy followed in March of 2017, closing most of what remained. Today, a small number of independently owned franchise locations still carry the RadioShack name, alongside a relaunched e-commerce site, but the dense nationwide footprint that once made the chain a genuine household fixture is entirely gone. The sheer density of RadioShack's old footprint is part of what makes its collapse feel so total in hindsight. Having a location within 5 minutes of nearly every American household meant the brand was, at its peak, more physically present in daily life than almost any other retailer in the country, arguably even more ubiquitous than fast food chains in certain regions. That same density became a liability once online shopping arrived, since RadioShack was left paying rent on thousands of small storefronts that increasingly made less sense as retail geography shifted toward either massive big-box locations or no physical footprint at all. One writer chronicling the brand's decline described it as a death spiral nobody saw coming, even though, in hindsight, nearly every warning sign, stagnant e-commerce, an unclear product identity, leadership that consistently downplayed the severity of the situation had been visible for the better part of a decade before the first bankruptcy filing actually arrived. Number 7. Bed Bath & Beyond. Leonard Feinstein and Warren Eisenberg opened the first bed and bath store in 1971, eventually rebranding to Bed Bath & Beyond as the concept expanded into a sprawling big-box format built around housewares, bedding, and kitchen goods. The chain became a genuine category killer, at one point counted among the Fortune 500, and its instantly recognizable big blue 20% off coupons became such a fixture of American shopping culture that they turned up as a running joke on the TV show Broad City, and, according to one widely repeated anecdote, were even found in the kitchen drawer of notorious mobster Whitey Bulger. Those same coupons that built Bed Bath & Beyond's brand identity eventually helped unravel it. Marketing employees later admitted the company had trained an entire generation of shoppers to view Bed Bath & Beyond merchandise as fundamentally overpriced unless purchased with a coupon in hand, which steadily eroded profit margins over decades. A disastrous 2019 leadership change brought in a new chief merchandising officer who pushed private label products and cut back on the very coupons customers had come to expect, further alienating loyal shoppers already drifting toward Amazon and Target. The company filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy on April 23, 2023, and after failing to find a buyer for its remaining roughly 360 stores, began full liquidation. The very last Bed Bath & Beyond locations closed their doors permanently on July 30, 2023, ending a 52-year run. A former marketing executive who spent 13 years at the company summed up the original appeal in a phrase that stuck with a lot of longtime customers. Stores were meant to be stacked floor to ceiling, giving shoppers a genuine treasure hunt feeling as they browsed. That same abundance eventually became a liability, since maintaining such enormous, densely packed inventory across hundreds of oversized stores required exactly the kind of capital investment the company could no longer afford once its finances started to erode. In the final weeks before liquidation, other retailers, including the Container Store, Big Lots, and Kirkland's, briefly agreed to honor unused Bed Bath & Beyond coupons out of what amounted to competitive goodwill, a small, strange coda to a chain whose entire identity had been built around that single blue slip of paper. Number 6. JCPenney. James Cash. Penny and William Henry McManus opened the first JCPenney store in Kmart, Wyoming in 1902, building a reputation for fair, transparent pricing that helped the chain grow into a genuine American institution over the following decades. JCPenney became a fixture of suburban mall culture through the mid-20th century, reaching its peak store count of just over 2,000 locations in 1973, and it later became an early adopter of both catalog shopping and, eventually, online retail. The company's more recent troubles trace largely to a disastrous 2012 rebrand under new CEO Ron Johnson, formerly of Apple's retail division, who eliminated JCPenney's traditional coupons and clearance sales entirely in favor of a confusing, fair and square, everyday low pricing scheme. Customers, trained for decades to expect regular sales, revolted, and sales fell 25% under Johnson's 16-month tenure before the company reversed course and fired him. JCPenney limped along for the rest of the decade under a revolving door of leadership before COVID-19 delivered the final blow, with the pandemic causing department store sales industry-wide to collapse by 47% in a single month. JCPenney filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy on May 15, 2020, with 846 stores and $3.6 billion in debt. A 2020 acquisition by mall operators Simon Property Group and Brookfield Asset Management kept a shrunken version of the chain alive. But JCPenney today operates a small fraction of the store count and the market presence it once commanded. What makes JCPenney's stumble particularly striking is just how avoidable it appeared in hindsight. Johnson's strategy wasn't irrational on paper. Banning the word sale and replacing near-constant discounting with genuinely fair, consistent pricing sounded like a reasonable way to build long-term trust with shoppers. But it fundamentally misread a customer base that had spent generations treating the hunt for a bargain as part of the shopping experience itself, not an inconvenience to be engineered away. By the time JCPenney reversed course and brought back its familiar sales cycles, the damage to both revenue and customer trust had already compounded for well over a year, a self-inflicted wound the company arguably never fully recovered from even before the pandemic arrived to finish the job. Number 5. Circuit City. Samuel Wurtzel founded what became Circuit City in 1949 as the Ward Company, and by the 1980s and 90s, the electronics retailer had grown into a genuine industry pioneer, credited with essentially inventing the big box electronics superstore format that Best Buy would later perfect and eventually surpass. At its height, Circuit City operated more than 700 stores and generated around $12 billion in annual sales. Circuit City's downfall is a frequently cited business school case study in self-inflicted decline. In 2003, the company famously laid off roughly 3,400 of its most experienced, highest commission sales associates in a cost-cutting move, replacing them with cheaper, less knowledgeable staff, a decision widely blamed for gutting the very customer service reputation that had once set Circuit City apart from competitors. Management also sold off valuable real estate assets to fund a 4-year stock buyback program, rather than reinvesting in aging, poorly located stores. When the 2008 financial crisis hit, Circuit City had no cushion left to absorb the shock. The company filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy in November of 2008, and after failing to find a buyer, converted to a full Chapter 7 liquidation. All 567 remaining U.S. stores closed permanently by March 8, 2009, displacing more than 30,000 employees in one of the largest single retail liquidations of the recession era. Notably, neither Best Buy nor Walmart even bothered submitting a bid for the stores, a fairly damning signal about how little remaining value industry insiders saw in the brand. Alan Wurtzel, son of the company's founder, spent years afterward trying to understand exactly how a business his father built from a single storefront had unraveled so completely. eventually writing an entire book on the subject titled Good to Great to Gone. His research pointed to a business that had found genuine success and then, in his own words, simply refused to speed up as the pace of the electronics industry accelerated around it. It's a fairly damning verdict from someone with about as much insider perspective as anyone could have, and it echoes a theme that runs through nearly every collapse on this list. Comfort with past success proving far more dangerous in the end than any single competitor ever managed to be. Number 4, Blockbuster. David Cook opened the first Blockbuster video in Dallas in October of 1985, and the chain grew explosively through the late 1980s and 1990s, eventually operating more than 9,000 stores worldwide and boasting over 50 million members at its peak. For an entire generation, a Friday night trip to Blockbuster to browse the new releases wall was a genuine cultural ritual, one that seemed, at the time, essentially permanent. Blockbuster's collapse is inseparable from its relationship with Netflix, which launched as a mail-order DVD rental service in 1998. According to accounts recounted in the Netflix documentary The Last Blockbuster, Blockbuster actually had the opportunity to acquire Netflix outright in its early years and passed. Blockbuster's own late-arriving DVD by mail service couldn't catch up once Netflix pivoted toward streaming, and the chain's heavy reliance on late fees, a genuine profit center that customers increasingly resented, gave Netflix's flat-rate, no-late-fee model an obvious opening. Blockbuster filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy in September of 2010, and its corporate-owned stores shut down entirely by 2014, leaving only scattered, independently owned franchise locations to fend for themselves. Those closed one by one over the following years until the franchise in Bend, Oregon became the last Blockbuster on the entire planet in 2019. A strange, accidental tourist attraction that remains open today, largely on nostalgia and gift shop merchandise sales. The Bend store's owners, Ken and Debbie Tischer, had leased that particular property since 1992, long before it ever became a Blockbuster, and they've stayed put through the franchise's rise, the corporate collapse around them, and its eventual transformation into a genuine pop culture curiosity. When the Netflix documentary aired in March of 2021, ironically streaming on the very platform that had put nearly every other Blockbuster out of business, the store reported being flooded with flowers, phone calls, and thank you notes from well-wishers around the world. It's a strange, almost poetic detail. The very company that killed Blockbuster ended up, decades later, helping keep its last surviving outpost alive as a novelty. Number 3, Toys R Us. Charles Lazarus opened the first Toys R Us in 1957, after realizing customers shopping at his father's Washington, D.C. baby furniture store kept asking about toys instead. The formula, essentially every toy imaginable stacked wall to wall under one roof, proved wildly successful. And by the 1980s and 90s, Toys R Us dominated the American toy industry as what retail analysts call a category killer, a store so comprehensive it effectively crowded out smaller, specialized competitors entirely. The beginning of the end traces to 2005, when 3 private equity firms, Bain Capital, KKR, and Vornado Realty Trust, took Toys R Us private in a $6.6 billion leveraged buyout. The deal loaded the company with roughly $5 billion in debt, forcing Toys R Us to funnel enormous portions of its cash flow toward interest payments rather than store upgrades, e-commerce investment, or genuine competitive improvements. Walmart, Target, and eventually Amazon steadily ate into Toys R Us's market share, while the chain, hamstrung by debt, simply couldn't respond. Toys R Us filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy in September of 2017 following a disappointing holiday season, and after failing to restructure its debt, announced in March of 2018 that it would close or sell all of its more than 700 remaining U.S. stores. Toy manufacturers who'd relied on Toys R Us for a massive share of their retail distribution scrambled to find new shelf space almost overnight. A handful of licensed store-within-a-store locations have popped up inside Macy's since the closure, but the standalone Toys R Us experience that defined childhood shopping trips for decades is gone. Toy industry veteran Richard Gottlieb later called the whole saga a cautionary tale, and the numbers back up just how central Toys R Us had been to that entire industry's health. At the time of the bankruptcy announcement, Toys R Us accounted for more than 10% of total sales for major toy makers like Hasbro, Mattel, and Jakks Pacific. And shares of all three companies fell sharply on the news, a rare case where a single retailer's collapse visibly rattled an entire manufacturing sector overnight. Foot traffic data from the years leading up to the bankruptcy told much the same story in slow motion. In-store visits had already dropped nearly 20% in 2016 alone, with roughly a third of toy shoppers by that point saying they preferred buying online instead, well before the formal bankruptcy filing made the underlying collapse official. Number 2. Kmart. Kmart's roots trace back to 1899, when Sebastian Kresge founded the S.S. Kresge Company, a five-and-dime chain that opened its first discount store under the Kmart name in Detroit in 1962. Kmart grew rapidly through the following decades, and by the 1990s, its Blue Light Special promotions, a flashing blue light announcing a surprise limited-time deal somewhere in the store, had become such a genuine cultural touchstone that Wharton Business School reportedly named a marketing teaching position after the company. At its peak, an estimated 95% of Americans lived within a short drive of a Kmart. Kmart's decline unfolded in painfully slow motion over more than 2 decades. The company filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy in January of 2002, at the time the largest retail bankruptcy in American history, closing more than 250 of its roughly 2,000 stores. Hedge fund manager Eddie Lampert then engineered a 2005 merger between Kmart and a struggling Sears, a combination many retail analysts argue was built more around financial engineering and real estate value than any coherent retail strategy. The merger failed to reverse either brand's fortunes, and Kmart filed for bankruptcy again in 2018 alongside Sears. The chain's final full-sized store in the continental United States, located in Bridgehampton, New York, closed on October 20th, 2024, drawing shoppers who reportedly flew in from across the country just to witness the end in person. What remains today is a single small-format store in Miami and a handful of locations in Guam and the U.S. Virgin Islands. Kmart's own missteps compounded well before Lampert ever entered the picture. Throughout the 1980s and early 1990s, the company diversified aggressively into unrelated businesses, acquiring Builders Square, Sports Authority, OfficeMax, and Borders itself, among others, spreading management attention across an increasingly unfocused portfolio rather than defending its core discount retail business against an increasingly aggressive Walmart. By the mid-1990s, Kmart had already sold or spun off most of those side ventures in a belated attempt to refocus. But the damage to both its balance sheet and its competitive position against Walmart had already been done. One retail historian summed up the underlying failure bluntly: stores that went as long as 50 years without meaningful renovation, paired with a debt-to-equity ratio that ballooned to 14 by 2011, when a healthy company typically sits under 4, made Kmart's eventual collapse less a surprise and more a long, slow formality. Number 1. Sears. Topping this list is arguably the single most dramatic retail collapse in American history. Richard Sears began selling watches as a side business in 1886 while working as a railroad station agent, and by 1893, alongside watch repairman Alva Roebuck, had built Sears, Roebuck and Company into a mail-order catalog empire that brought affordable goods to rural Americans decades before anyone imagined overnight shipping. By 1972, Sears was valued at $18 billion, worth roughly $135 billion in today's money. And at its absolute peak, the company accounted for an astonishing 1% of the entire United States economy, a scale of dominance no modern retailer, Amazon included, has matched relative to the size of the country's economy at the time. Sears remained the largest retailer in America for most of the 20th century, only losing that title to Walmart in 1990. From there, the decline compounded steadily. Eddie Lampert's hedge fund acquired Sears in 2005 for $11 billion, merging it with Kmart in a deal that mirrored many of the same financial engineering criticisms leveled at the Kmart transaction. Sears posted its final annual profit in 2010 and lost money continuously from that point forward, selling off beloved-owned brands like Craftsman to Stanley Black and Decker in 2017 for $775 million, just to stay afloat a little longer. The company filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy on October 15, 2018, after 125 years in business, entering bankruptcy with 687 stores, down from a combined peak of roughly 3,500 alongside Kmart in 2006. As of 2025, fewer than 10 Sears stores remain open in the entire United States, a staggering fall for a company once so dominant that a Fortune retrospective called it, quite reasonably, more influential in its day than Amazon is in ours. What makes Sears's collapse land differently than any other name on this list is just how far ahead of its time the company genuinely was before everything fell apart. Sears pioneered mail-order catalog shopping decades before anyone conceived of e-commerce, essentially inventing the direct-to-consumer retail model the entire internet would eventually rebuild from scratch. The company even partnered with IBM in 1984 to offer early online shopping and email through a service called Prodigy, one of the very first consumer internet platforms, years before most Americans had ever heard the word internet. Sears, in other words, wasn't a company that failed to see the future coming. It built pieces of that future itself, decades early, and then somehow still managed to lose the very race it had helped start. By the time the bankruptcy filing became official, Sears's workforce had shrunk to under 90,000 employees across fewer than 900 stores, a fraction of the 355,000 employees and 3,500 combined Sears and Kmart locations the merged company had carried as recently as 2006, and its stock, once trading close to $200 a share in 2007, had collapsed to under a single dollar by the time bankruptcy became unavoidable. The common thread. Look across all 10 of these collapses, and a few patterns repeat almost every single time. Crushing debt from leveraged buyouts or aggressive mergers shows up in Kmart, Sears, and Toys R Us alike, each one saddled with obligations that left no room to actually invest in the stores customers were supposed to keep shopping at. A failure to take e-commerce seriously early enough sank Borders, RadioShack, and Circuit City, each of them letting Amazon build an insurmountable head start while debating internal strategy. And in nearly every case, the companies that eventually replaced them, Amazon, Best Buy, Walmart, Target, simply moved faster and carried less dead weight. There's also a quieter pattern worth naming. Nearly every chain on this list was, at some point, considered too big to fail. Sears accounted for a full % of the national economy. Toys R Us controlled such a massive share of toy distribution that its bankruptcy visibly dented earnings at Hasbro and Mattel. Kmart's footprint once reached 95% of the American population. Scale, it turns out, isn't the same thing as durability. A company can dominate its category so completely that almost nobody, inside or outside the business, seriously questions whether it might one day simply cease to exist, right up until the year it actually does. None of these were bad ideas to begin with. Every single chain on this list built something millions of Americans genuinely loved, whether that was a Friday night video rental, a coupon that made housewares feel affordable, or a store where a kid could see every toy that existed under one roof. What killed them almost never had anything to do with customers losing interest in the underlying idea. It had everything to do with the businesses behind those ideas failing to keep up with how fast everything else around them was changing. If you enjoyed this look back at America's fallen retail giants, give this video a like and subscribe for more deep dives into the brands that used to run American shopping and the mistakes that brought them down.